They say the loudest person in the room is often the weakest, but the quietest person is the one you should truly fear. For 25 years, I was the invisible ghost in the Valerius family mansion. I was the wife who stayed in the background, the woman who hosted the perfect dinners, arranged the finest orchids, and ironed the perfect shirts, while my husband, Marcus, built a real estate empire called Ethelgard Holdings on the very foundation of my family's old wealth. I am Evelyn, and at 52, I was told that my time had run out. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with a heavy rhythmic thud, the only sound in a house that felt increasingly like a tomb. Marcus looked at me across our polished marble kitchen island, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once held 30 years ago. He didn't say a word at first. He simply slid a thick manila envelope across the cold stone surface. It made a dry, scratching sound that set my teeth on edge. Inside were the divorce papers. He handed them to me as if he were handing me a grocery list or a dry cleaning receipt. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "It's over, Evelyn," he said, his voice as flat as the horizon. "We've grown apart. You've become dry, like an old parchment. I need someone with more color, more life, someone who understands where I'm going, not just where I've been." I knew exactly what he meant by color. He meant his 24-year-old lead architect, Isabella, a girl young enough to be the daughter we never had. I had seen her in the office, her laughter ringing too loud, her hands lingering too long on Marcus's arm during strategy meetings. She was already wearing the diamond earrings I'd picked out for our silver anniversary, the ones that had mysteriously gone missing from my jewelry box a month ago. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to understand who Marcus was when I met him. He wasn't the titan of industry you see on the covers of business magazines today. When I met Marcus, he was a man with a single worn-out suit and a blueprint that no one would fund. He was hungry, desperate, and charming in a way that only a man with nothing to lose can be. My father, the late Arthur Valerius, saw right through him. "He's a climber, Evelyn," my father had warned me over tea in this very house. "He doesn't love you, he loves the ground you stand on." But I was 22 and blinded by the romance of being someone's muse. I fought my father for Marcus. I brought him into the inner circles of the city's elite. I used the Valerius name to open doors that would have remained triple bolted to a man like him. I gave him the seed capital from my mother's inheritance to start Ethelgard Holdings. For 30 years, I was the silent engine behind his success. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m. correcting his proposals. I was the one who charmed the wives of the city council members to get those impossible zoning permits. I was the shadow that made him look like a sun. As the years turned into decades, the power shifted. As Ethelgard Holdings grew into a multi-billion-dollar entity, Marcus began to believe his own myth. He started to think he'd done it all himself. He started to see my quiet nature not as a strength, but as a lack of ambition. He wanted a trophy, not a partner. He wanted someone who would adore his power, not someone who remembered him when he couldn't afford a subway fare. "I've already had your things packed," Marcus continued, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my calm eyes. "You can have the cottage in the north. It's quiet there. It suits you. The prenuptial agreement we signed is very clear, Evelyn. You get a modest stipend, the cottage, and your personal effects. The rest, the mansion, the firm, the assets, remains with me. I've built this empire, and I intend to keep it." He smiled then, that arrogant predator smile he used before closing a hostile takeover. He told me I had 48 hours to pack my life and leave the house my grandfather had built. He thought I would cry. He thought I would beg for a larger settlement or scream about the unfairness of it all. But I didn't. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing a single tear. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out a fountain pen, my grandfather's pen, the one he used to sign the charter for Orenthal Trust, and I signed the papers with a hand so steady it surprised even me. Marcus didn't notice the pen. He didn't notice the way I looked at him, not with sadness, but with the cold, clinical gaze of an appraiser looking at a piece of junk. 48 hours, I repeated softly. I'll be gone before then, Marcus. Good, he said, already turning his attention back to his smartphone, dismissed as if I were a servant who had finished her shift. As I walked out of that kitchen, I felt the weight of 25 years of silence falling away. Marcus thought I was a fool because I turned a blind eye to the late-night site visits and the scent of Isabella's cloying jasmine perfume on his collar. But he forgot one crucial thing. I wasn't quiet because I was afraid. I was quiet because I was observing. For the last 5 years, I had watched Marcus become reckless. I had watched him take shortcuts, bypass regulations, and hide assets in shell companies to avoid taxes. And because he thought I was just a housewife, he never bothered to hide his ledgers from me. He discussed his dirty deals on the phone while I was in the same room, assuming I was too preoccupied with flower arrangements to understand. I understood every word. I knew every offshore account in the Caymans. I knew about the bribes paid to the inspectors for the Ethelgard Plaza project. I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing on the oak wood. In the master bedroom, my suitcases were already waiting, packed by the domestic staff who couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't care about the clothes or the furs. I walked past them to the small built-in safe behind the portrait of my mother. Marcus didn't have the code. He never thought I had anything worth stealing. Inside wasn't gold or jewelry. It was a collection of leather-bound journals and a single rusted iron key. These journals contained the true history of the Valerius estate, records my father had kept that never made it into the digital archives of Ethelgard Holdings. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the manicured lawn, I saw Marcus and Isabella out on the balcony. They were laughing, a bottle of Cristal in a silver bucket between them. Isabella was leaning against him, her hands splayed across his chest in a gesture of ownership. They looked down at the city as if they owned it. They thought they had stripped the old swan of her feathers and left her to freeze. But they failed to realize that when you spend 25 years being invisible, you learn how to move in the dark without making a sound. You learn that the strongest structures are often built on the shakiest ground. I took my single suitcase and walked out the front door. I didn't look back. I drove away from the lights of the mansion and headed towards that quiet cottage in the north. Marcus thought he was sending me to a graveyard. He didn't realize he was sending me to my armory. The game was only just beginning, and Marcus Valerius was about to learn that the most dangerous person is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to remember.
The drive to the northern cottage was long and shrouded in a thick mountain mist that seemed to swallow the road behind me. Every mile I traveled away from the Valerius mansion felt like a layer of old skin peeling away. Marcus thought he had exiled me to a place of isolation, a small forgotten cabin on the edge of a cliff, but to me this wasn't a prison, it was a sanctuary. The cottage was an old stone structure built by my great-grandfather long before the city's skyscrapers had even been a dream. It smelled of cedar wood, dried lavender, and history that Marcus did never buy with all the money in Ethelgard Holdings. I arrived in the middle of the night, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the dark surface of the lake below. I didn't go inside to sleep. I didn't even unpack my suitcase. My mind was a fever of numbers, dates, and legal loopholes. I walked straight to the garden shed, a small vine-covered building that sat at the very edge of the property. Inside, under a heavy oak workbench with a loose floorboard, I pried it open with a crowbar, my breath hitching in the cold air. Beneath the earth lay a rusted metal box sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside this box were the original documents of the Valerius land grants. Marcus believed that when he took over the family firm, he had inherited the land itself. He was wrong. My father, in his infinite wisdom and deep-seated distrust of Marcus, had structured the ownership in a way that was nearly impossible to find in modern digital records. The land on which Ethelgard Plaza, Marcus's billion-dollar pride and joy, was built had never been sold to the company. It was held in a private family trust, and the lease agreement between the trust and the corporation was a 99-year contract that was set to expire in exactly 72 hours. I sat at the small wooden table in the cottage, lit only by a single flickering candle, and began to spread out the yellowed parchments. For 25 years, I had kept this secret, waiting for the moment Marcus would show his true face. And now he had. I pulled out my laptop, a device Marcus didn't even know I owned, and began to access the encrypted files I had been building for 5 years. While he was out at expensive galas with Isabella, I had been documenting every single illegal zoning bribe, every off-the-books payment to city officials, and every offshore account he used to hide dividends from the board of directors. The first 24 hours were the quietest of my life. I knew Marcus was back at the mansion, probably redecorating my bedroom to suit Isabella's tacky modern taste. He was likely throwing a party, celebrating his freedom from the boring, dry wife who had held him back. But while he was drinking champagne, I was sending a series of encrypted emails to the 3 most ruthless property lawyers in the state, men who had been bruised by Marcus's aggressive business tactics in the past and were hungry for a chance at a reckoning. By the second day, the silence was broken. My phone, which I had kept on silent, began to light up like a distress signal. Marcus was calling, first once, then 5 times, then 10. He didn't leave voicemails at first, but as the hours passed, his messages became increasingly frantic. I didn't answer. I wanted the panic to set in. I wanted him to feel the ground shifting beneath his feet without knowing why. The news broke on the afternoon of the second day. A small independent financial blog, one I had fed a tip to months ago, published a report questioning the land titles of the Valerius Heights district. At first, the market ignored it, but then the major banks started to take notice. Orenthal Trust, the bank my grandfather had founded, was the first to freeze Marcus's credit lines. They knew the name Valerius, and they knew that if I wasn't signing the papers, the collateral was worthless. I could imagine the scene at Ethelgard Plaza, Marcus screaming at his assistants, throwing his expensive crystal decanters against the wall, demanding to know why a dead lease could suddenly reappear. He would be calling his lawyers, the ones who had told him his prenuptial agreement was airtight. They would be the ones to break the news to him. The prenuptial agreement protected his shares in the company, but it didn't give him the land. Without the land, the building was a liability, not an asset. Isabella would be there too, her eyes wide with a different kind of fear. Not the fear of losing Marcus, but the fear of losing the lifestyle he promised her. I had watched her through the security cameras I had secretly installed in the office months ago, cameras he never noticed because he never looked at the security logs. I saw her face go pale as the corporate office manager informed her that her corporate credit card had been declined at the jeweler's. The parasite was realizing the host was in trouble. As the second sun began to set over the northern hills, I prepared my final move. I wasn't just going to take his money, I was going to take his dignity. I had spent a lifetime being the anchor that kept him steady, and now I was going to be the storm that broke him apart. I dressed in a suit of dark navy, the color of a midnight sea, and prepared to head back to the city. The 48-hour deadline he had given me to pack my life was almost up, but I wasn't going back to pack, I was going to collect. The game of power is often won not by the one who strikes the hardest, but by the one who knows where the foundation is weakest. Marcus Valerius had built a glass house, and he had forgotten that I was the one who held the stones. The drive back to the city felt like a funeral procession, but not for me. It was for the man Marcus Valerius had pretended to be. As I crossed the bridge and saw the skyline, my eyes went straight to Ethelgard Plaza, that monolith of glass and steel that bore his name in glowing blue letters. To the world, it was a symbol of success. To me, it was a tombstone built on a stolen foundation. The lights in the executive penthouse were blazing, a stark contrast to the dark offices below. I knew he was up there, pacing, trapped in a cage of his own making. I pulled into the private garage of the plaza exactly 46 hours after I had been told to leave my home. I didn't use the back entrance. I walked straight through the grand lobby, my heels clicking on the polished obsidian floors with the precision of a countdown. The security guards, men I had known by name for a decade, looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. They had seen the news. They had heard the whispers that the company was on the brink of a catastrophic collapse. I didn't say a word. I simply nodded and walked toward the private elevator. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, the air was thick with the scent of desperation and stale cigarette smoke, a habit Marcus had picked up again after 10 years.
The glass doors to his office were open. Inside, Marcus was hunched over his desk, his tailored suit jacket discarded on the floor, his shirt sleeves rolled up in a way that looked frantic rather than productive. Isabella was standing by the window, her arms crossed, looking out at the city as if she were already searching for her next target. The room was silent until the sound of my footsteps hit the carpet. Marcus looked up, and for a split second, I saw a flash of the man I used to love, the man who was once grateful for a seat at my father's table. But it vanished, replaced by a desperate, ugly hope. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over a glass of amber liquid. "Evelyn, thank God, where have you been? The banks, the lawyers, they're talking about a lease from 1890. It's some kind of mistake, some clerical error. You have the original files, don't you? You can fix this. Just sign the affidavit saying the land was transferred in the merger. I've already got my notary on the way." He moved toward me, his hands reaching out as if to grab a lifeline, but I stepped back, the distance between us feeling like an ocean. "I'm not here to fix your mistakes, Marcus," I said, my voice calm and cold as a mountain stream. "I'm here to enforce the terms of the eviction. You gave me 48 hours to pack my life. I'm giving you the same courtesy. The lease on this land expired at midnight. As of this moment, you are trespassing on Valerius property." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella turned from the window, her youthful face contorted with a sneer. "You're crazy," she spat. "Marcus built this. This building is worth billions. You can't just take it because of some old piece of paper. We'll tie you up in court for years." I looked at her, not with anger, but with a profound sense of boredom. "Isabella, dear, you're an architect. You should know that a building is only as strong as the ground it sits on, and this ground belongs to the Obsidian Collective, a private trust that I happen to lead. As for the courts, I've already filed the injunctions. The banks have already pulled the loans. The billions you're talking about are currently being liquidated to cover the bribes Marcus paid to the zoning board, bribes I have the digital receipts for." Marcus's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. He slumped back into his leather chair, the realization finally sinking in. He had spent 30 years building an empire, and he had forgotten that he had built it on borrowed time and borrowed blood. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave you everything. The mansion, the life, the status." "You gave me a cage, Marcus," I replied, walking toward the window to look out at the city I had helped him conquer. "You thought I was the anchor dragging you down, but I was the only thing keeping you from drifting into the abyss. You called me dry parchment. Well, parchment may be old, but it holds the truth long after the ink of a lie has faded. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed the name that gave you everything. You thought you were the visionary, but you were just the salesman. I was the architect." I reached into my bag and pulled out a single elegant envelope, the exact same kind he had handed me in the kitchen. I placed it on the desk. "These are the final terms. I am buying out your remaining shares of Ethelgard Holdings for pennies on the dollar. It's enough for you to live a quiet life in a small apartment, perhaps even that cottage you thought was good enough for me. If you sign, I withhold the evidence of your fraud from the federal prosecutors. If you don't, you'll be trading that tailored suit for a prison jumpsuit by the end of the week." Marcus looked at the papers, then at Isabella, who was already reaching for her designer handbag and heading toward the door, without a second glance at him. The parasite had found the host was officially dead. Marcus was left alone in a glass tower that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by the ghosts of his own greed. He picked up the pen, the cheap plastic one from his desk, and his hand shook as he scrawled his name. As I walked out of that office for the last time, I didn't feel the rush of vengeance I thought I would. I felt a strange, quiet rebirth. I wasn't the wife of a titan anymore. I wasn't the invisible ghost of a mansion. I was Evelyn Valerius, and for the first time in 52 years, the ground beneath my feet was entirely my own.
The day the blue neon letters of Ethelgard Holdings were finally lowered from the top of the plaza was a day of absolute silence in the city. I stood across the street, wearing a simple trench coat, watching as the cranes, the same cranes Marcus once thought were his scepter of power, dismantled his legacy letter by letter. To the onlookers, it was just a corporate restructuring. To me, it was the final removal of a cancer that had grown over my family's name for 3 decades. Marcus was gone. He had signed the papers and vanished into the gray obscurity of a life he had once mocked, a life of budgets, small rooms, and the crushing weight of being ordinary. Isabella, as I had predicted, didn't last a week by his side once the funds were frozen. I heard through the grapevine that she had tried to sue him for emotional distress, only to realize that there was nothing left to take. She was last seen at an airport, heading to a city where her beauty might still be traded for a temporary sanctuary. They were both victims of their own shallow reflections, looking for gold in a mirror that could only ever reflect their own greed. But I didn't spend my time thinking about them. I had a kingdom to rebuild, and this time the foundation would be made of something far stronger than ego. I didn't keep the money from the liquidation for myself. I didn't need another mansion or a fleet of cars to feel powerful. I realized that true power isn't about how much you can accumulate, but how much you can transform. I turned the Valerius Heights district into a beacon of a different kind of progress. I established the Valerius Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing high-level legal and financial resources to women who had been pushed into the shadows of their husbands' empires, women like me who had been the silent architects of successes they were never allowed to claim. We built affordable housing for single mothers right in the heart of the city, on the very land Marcus wanted to turn into luxury condos for the elite. A few months later, I returned to that small cottage in the north. The air was crisp and the lake was as still as a sheet of glass. I sat on the porch holding a cup of tea, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't listening for the sound of Marcus's car in the driveway or the tone of his voice to gauge his mood. I was listening to the wind in the pines and the beating of my own heart. I pulled out the journals my father had left me, the ones Marcus thought were worthless. I began to write my own story in the blank pages at the end, not as a wife of or a daughter of, but as a woman who had walked through the fire and come out not just unburned, but tempered. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that kitchen island where this all began. I remember the coldness of the divorce papers and the way Marcus looked at me with such dismissive pity. I realize now that he didn't hand me an end, he handed me a key. He thought he was throwing me away, but he was actually releasing me from a cage I had become too comfortable in. To every woman who has ever felt invisible at 50, to every heart that has been told it is dry parchment, I want you to look at the horizon and remember the sun doesn't just set, it prepares for a new dawn. Your silence is not your weakness, it is your preparation. The city still stands, and the plaza has a new name now, one that represents integrity rather than vanity. My name is Evelyn Valerius. I am no longer a ghost, and I am no longer silent. I have found my voice in the quiet, and I have found my strength in the shadows. I am 52, I am alone, and I am never more powerful. The best chapters of my life weren't written in the mansions of my past. They are being written right now, in the freedom of my present. And as I watch the sun dip below the mountain peaks, I smile, knowing that the world is finally seeing me, not as a reflection, but as the light itself.